Let's see.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining today's session. Today we invite Mr. Per Stenius, the CEO of Leather Company. He will talk about the competitiveness of Korean technology startup and what it can provide to global corporation. And hello, Mr. Stenius, and could you briefly introduce yourself and start the presentation?
Sure. Thanks for the honor. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I can provide some value and some interesting insights for the audience. Yeah, at Redel, we actually work with all sizes of companies, so we call it business development as a service. So our typical model is to work long-term with our client companies. The longest relationships are over 10 years old, just as long as the company has been. We work with companies all over the world. We have offices in Helsinki, in Seoul, in Kuala Lumpur, and also in the Middle East. And our staff has been physically in, I think, over 40 countries by now. And here in Seoul, we have been working here since 2012. We made a company visit here in 2011 to see the Korean growth miracle happening. And then we got excited about that and decided to set up an office here. And as many of you know, Korean growth hasn't been the same since then. So the last 10 years has been a little bit tough times for the Korean economy, but it has been very interesting. And my personal perspective is that I really enjoy being here in Seoul because it is like a future lab. I think in Europe, and I think many of the participants are from Europe or have that background, we will see many of the changes that the Korean society and the Korean government is trying to solve today here in Korea. Similar challenges and changes will come to Europe. And as a result, I think we who are here in Seoul and here in Asia, we are seeing the future a little bit ahead of our European compatriots. So all in all, I think despite the difficulties sometimes in the economy and all that, I think Korea is a very interesting place to be in. I guess I can move into the presentation. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you now see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Very good. Right, so the purpose of today's presentation is really to talk a little bit about the Korean technology startup ecosystem and what it means for global corporations. And I think this is sort of like a win-win situation for both Korea as well as, well, let's say here, European companies, because even though I think many of us here believe and think that Korea is very advanced technologically, reality is that in the technology startup area, Korea is still developing. And similarly, in the venture capital area, Korea is developing. So despite all the advances that the chaebols are doing, we don't actually see the same level of innovation in the startup level. And so that's what I want to talk about today, because I think it's important that Korea has a lively startup ecosystem that will be critical for renewing the Korean economy, which is in much need of the renewal, in my opinion. And at the same time, a lively startup ecosystem will provide interesting opportunities for global corporations for acquisitions. And of course, global corporations are already used to this. You know, many of the corporations, many probably of your own corporations have already acquired companies in Europe, maybe in the US, or maybe in some other markets. However, acquisitions by European companies in Korea are still fairly scarce. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And let me just outline a little bit the key messages here. So one thing I want to start with is, first of all, I mean, some of you in the audience might not be that familiar with the startup ecosystem landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it looks on a global level. And I'm going to provide some insights into what makes a good ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about the Nordic ecosystem, which I'm familiar with. Before Redel, I was part of a venture capital firm. And so I've been part of that. And I was also a CEO for a startup company, which we then later sold to an American company, which now is listed on the NASDAQ and is doing quite well. So I've been part of this cycle myself. And I just want to give some perspective on how Korea and Seoul stands versus other well-known hotspots in the world. The second part will talk a little bit about how the Korean venture capital and private equity ecosystem is developing and what drives it. Korea is quite different from many of the European and American ecosystems in the sense that the government and the chaebols have a big effect on how the ecosystem evolves. And that's been both good and bad. So I'll talk a little bit about that and where we stand today. A big part of this is also the legislative environment. Then I'll talk about the private equity players, the companies who are actually making these kind of investments. Many of them have so far focused on industrial and consumer goods. And if you read the news today in Korea Times, for example, you could see that Carlyle, which is a global private equity firm, is buying to some place from Anchor Private Equity or Anchor Equity Capital, which is a semi-local based from Hong Kong, but they are a Seoul-based private equity player. That's a typical thing that you see here in Korea because a lot of the private equity is focused on industrial and consumer goods. And what we are, of course, focused on in this talk is more about the technology startups and how they are, coming about. But there's some good news about this. M&A is definitely picking up, and I want to talk more about that. And finally, I want to give you a little bit of a toolkit on how to approach this kind of process. So if any of you are in the business development or strategy department, the last section is for you. So it's basically a sort of a guideline on what to think about when you try to look for interesting target companies to acquire, and then also a little bit how the process goes. And I want to apologize already now because unfortunately my slides are very text heavy and very detailed and very data driven. And I have way too many slides. So I'm not going to go into the detail in this presentation for all the slides. I'm going to jump over some. But my idea was that you will get these slides after the talk, and so you can study and go deeper, and that way, you get something tangible out of this. So not just pretty pictures, but actually you can dig deeper if you want. And at the end of the presentation, there's also some links for further readings if you're interested in this topic. And of course, my contact information is also there should you want to talk to me in person or have a coffee and chat about this topic. So always happy to exchange ideas and thoughts about this. And I think we have the normal process here in ECCK is that at the end we have a Q&A, and you can put your questions into the chat, and we can then have a discussions at the end. So I'll try to keep this talk at about 30, 35, 40 minutes, and then we can move on. And if somebody has a question in between, feel free to interrupt me, no problem with that. I'm sort of flexible on that side. All right, first of all, how does a startup ecosystem evolve? So there are a number of factors, and it's actually not easy to create a good startup ecosystem. So people always talk about Silicon Valley. But one thing you have to remember is that Silicon Valley has developed over decades. So they already started in the 1950s and 1960s. And if you think about other venture capital areas like London, for example, UK was among the first ones. After the war, they started startup investment and technology investment. So in fact, developing a startup ecosystem is a long process, and all of these factors that I have listed here on the page play a role there. In addition, what plays a big role is the culture itself. What is the cultural environment? And I think this is, it's listed here first on the page, but this is actually a big factor here in Korea because we don't have a culture of technology startups and how to be sort of entrepreneurial. Today, still, many families or parents want their children to go to chaebols because that's a sure way of getting high income and a stable future, or at least that's how they think about it. The other problem we have here in Korea is the support. Government is excessively supporting this environment, but like in many other countries, government support is not the key. So there's been a lot of research about this, but the more the government interferes with the venture capital environment and the startup ecosystem, the less it actually develops. So there is a balance of how much the government should be involved. Capital and knowledge, these are critical. What should be recognized, though, is that capital needs to flow in from parties who can invest quite freely. So if the capital is government or chaebol capital, that is not enough. There needs to be investors who are so financing investors. Knowledge is also critical. Now, in Korea, I think we all agree there's a lot of smart people here, and there's a lot of technology insight. And you find those people at Samsung and Hyundai and many of the other big companies. However, the problem is that knowledge doesn't come out of there into the startups. And so that's one of the challenges. It's not the lack of knowledge in Korea per se, but the fact that it doesn't sort of transfer into the startup ecosystem. And finally, then the market and corporations, their activity in the market is important. Now, let me just skip ahead and go to the next slide. What you see here, and by the way, I may be speaking a little bit too fast, so I'll try to pace myself. Sorry, my bad habit. What you see here is an outline of different hotspots on the planet today. There are more. This is not an exhaustive list, but these regions are typically known as sort of hotspots among the technology startup environment. And as you can see, Seoul is represented, and it's actually ranked pretty high. Ranking 23 is actually not a bad ranking at all. But what you can see also from Seoul is that if you look at the VC investments per capita, that's a very low number. Now, I tried to also illustrate a little bit what are the sort of top topics in each area. So each one of these hotspots has a little bit different profile. So London and Silicon Valley are distinct. Similarly, Tel Aviv is different from Beijing, for example. Now, in Seoul, the big challenge is the VC investments per capita. So there's a lot of technology here, and there's a lot of interest in technology, but the investment number is very low. And that means that the startup companies typically are not what we would call deep tech. And we have similar problems also elsewhere in Southeast Asia. I haven't listed any locations here, but Kuala Lumpur, Ho Chi Minh City, or Singapore could be considered hotspots for similar kind of startups. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go into detail of this, but what is interesting is that the Nordic region is standing out in terms of the environment, because these countries are very small. So Finland, Sweden, Norway, they are typically 5 to 10 million people, inhabitants. Denmark the same, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even lower. What's interesting about these hotspots is that they have worked together in a nice symbiotic way. And they don't have a big local market. And that you might think that, oh, that's a bad thing. Certainly it's a bad thing when compared to US startups. But the good thing here is that because of that reason, because the technology startups in these countries cannot find markets in their home country, they have to be global from the start. So that has actually helped this region. The other thing that has helped is the active collaboration between these countries. So people can move fairly freely between these countries, and technology entrepreneurs are working across. There's also plenty of capital, and you can see that the investment levels are very high compared to the population that we have there and so on. Of course, these countries all also have a strong technology base. The Nordic countries, certainly after Second World War, developed a very strong industrial base. Sweden had that already before, just as Denmark did. Norway have benefited from its oil. And Finland, funnily enough, has benefited from the fact that it lost the Second World War and it had to pay a big war damage to Russia. And this actually built up the industrial infrastructure in Finland. And after the 50s, Finland already was sort of on a good track growing up. Nowadays, Finland is no longer dependent on Russia. So the trade between Russia and Finland has decreased quite a bit. But instead, Finland is selling the technology globally. The other thing about Finland, which you might be familiar of, is that Nokia collapsed. So Nokia was a leading handset manufacturer. And again, you might say that, hey, that's really bad news. That can't be good for the technology environment. But it actually the opposite happened. Because Nokia collapsed and a lot of engineers had to leave the company, and I have to say, Nokia also supported them leaving. So Nokia paid them good sort of payments at the end of their work, and they also invested in some of the startups that these employees started. As a result, there was a big boom in the technology sector. So also that negative effect turned out to be a positive factor for Finland. Now, I'm not going to say that what we need is that Samsung collapses in Korea. That would be too drastic. Obviously, we are very dependent on Samsung here in Korea. But the fact that a large inflow of highly trained, I mean people who are really deep in the technology and have worked in a global corporation, when they flow into the job market and when there is capital available for them to make startups, and the atmosphere in the country is geared towards that. That is a very big benefit and can actually serve to speed up the startup ecosystem. So Finland in 2000, when I was doing investments in startups, was still not that experienced. Now in 2020, Finland is one of the leading hotspots when it comes to certain areas like gaming, AI, also deep technology like graphic processors, space technology, and things like that. So sometimes you need bad news to create a good ecosystem. All right, let me move on. So how about Seoul? As I said, Seoul actually has a lot of good things. Certainly knowledge, market and corporation, also support, especially government support. Unfortunately, I would argue that the culture and environment is still sort of not developed enough. So from that point of view, Seoul lags behind it. There's not a tradition. And this was the same in Finland in 2000. So there wasn't much of a tradition of venture capital and technology startups. And so it takes usually 10 to 20 years to create that. Now, given the activity in Seoul today, we can expect that maybe 2030, this area could be a very active startup ecosystem. I mean, in the sense that it actually creates real life IPOs and real life globally known companies who then become sort of famous and live a life of their own. The other thing where Seoul is strong is, of course, the knowledge. There's a lot of technology here, but unfortunately, that is a little bit restricted in the sense that the chaebols tend to hog all the best resources in the country. I listed here that capital is low, and this is sort of true and false in a sense. There is a lot of capital, but what I mean by it being low is that very little of the capital is actually directed into venture capital and startups. And this has a little bit to do with the Korean mentality of you're not allowed to fail. So somehow in Korea, there still is this mentality that every project has to be successful. And that fits very poorly with venture capital, because in a typical venture capital fund, let's say you have a $50 million fund, you're going to invest in maybe 10 companies in your portfolio. Out of these, one company will bring you the returns, and 2 companies maybe bring you some sort of added benefits, added returns, and the rest will fail. So in fact, venture capital and technology startups is an area where you have to accept the fact that you are looking for stars, and most of your candidates will die along the way. And that doesn't really fit with the Korean mentality. And here the government influence comes in as well, because the government in particular is afraid of failure. So everything the government funds and everything the government does has to succeed. At least it has to look like it succeeds. And as a result, then the funding and the regulations related to that is overly restrictive, and it doesn't drive the kind of innovative, creative destruction that you would like to have in this kind of context. All right, so we're about 20 minutes into the discussion here, and I'll try to go fast so that we cover the other topics as well in sort of 20 minutes. Now, this Korean startup ecosystem has really been, its start was somewhere around 2000 or so. So there hasn't been a long tradition of technology startups in Korea. And I would say that when I first visited Seoul in 2011, at that point, there was some kind of boom. There was a lot of accelerators and other things, which then petered out in the years that follow. And I think we are now in 2020 seeing another similar boom. But let me go back in history a little bit before we talk about that. So one thing to remember about the Asian national economies is that they have been built in a very different way than the European modern economies. Now, if you go back in history in Europe far enough, and I would say all the way to the Industrial Revolution, what you see there is that the UK was by far the leading economy. So UK very quickly went through the Industrial Revolution. And then you might ask yourself, well, okay, nowadays Germany is very strong. How did it catch up? Well, Germany actually caught up with UK back in those, centuries ago, exactly the same way Korea has been doing since the 50s. So what happened there was that there was an industrial policy, and the banks were either regional banks or, like in Korea, government banks, and then they invested their funds to drive up the industry. And that's what happened in Korea today, that we still have a situation where government and the presidential office sets the industrial policy. I mean, you may have heard about the 5-year plans. In the last 10 years, that has failed a little bit because creative economy is not a plan, and the current president hasn't really made a plan at all. But the president before that, even Lee Myung-bak, they had a certain policy that was very clear. So Lee Myung-bak, for example, was renewable energy and green economy. Park Geun-hye, she had this creative economy, but that really wasn't really clear what it meant. Anyways, the key point is that the state puts the policy, the banks execute on that, they invest in those areas to provide loans, and then they give that money to chaebols to drive that economy. Now, unfortunately, 2 things happen here. SMEs, or small and medium-sized enterprises, they are marginalized. And similarly, as you can see here in Korea, Korea is not very positive for multinational corporations. I mean, we have a bunch of them, but certainly not as much as many other regions have. So there's a negative effect of this chaebol-led thing. Now, this kind of strategy is called substitution strategy, and its purpose is to build a strong industrial platform, by which one can then go global. Now, and that has worked fine for Korea in the past. That is exactly why Korea grew from 1950 all the way to 2000. But in the current economy, when you have achieved that, and when you are trying to sort of kickstart the lower branches of the economy, SMEs and startups, that policy doesn't work. And this is very different from Germany, because Germany has, over the years, and it has taken many, many decades, obviously, has built a very strong network of globally competitive SMEs, typically family-owned. And maybe you have heard the term Mittelstand, which is the German sort of a backbone of their economy. So Germany is not only about Mercedes and BMW and you know, the big German companies, but it's also about very strong network of SMEs, which are extremely technically capable. The interesting comparison, by the way, Korea and Japan. In Japan, the chaebols, or what we call keiretsus, they have their own banks. So there, the government control is less, whereas in Korea, state actually controls the bank still quite a lot. Now, I just mentioned here that Singapore and Malaysia have a little bit of a different model, which doesn't quite marginalize SMEs as much, but still has a negative effect. Singapore and Malaysia have been more positive about MNCs, and that has driven their economy. I think it's called Penang outside in Malaysia. That's an island where there's a lot of international technology companies. So Intel, for example, have been, Penang actually is the island, has been there since 1960s. So Malaysia, for example, has a very strong base of international technology companies in certain regions. Singapore, obviously, as well, more a banking environment. And then Taiwan and Vietnam has also have a little bit different kind of approach. I'm not going to go into the details of this. If you go to our website, you will find this full presentation that talks about these things, and we can go with that. But what is the effect on Korea? So what happens for SMEs in Korea is that there's a vicious cycle, and there's and that's actually dominating the economy. So one thing people don't perhaps understand when you walk along Teheran Row, when you look at the big buildings and you look at the people in suits, is that 90% of the Korean workforce does not work on Teheran Row, does not work for chaebols. 90% of the Korean workforce works for SMEs. And these SMEs are actually extremely unproductive. And they typically have very little funds available for R&D. Most of the SMEs dream about being a prime supplier to a chaebol, which is good. That's a long, steady bread. You can sort of count on that. But the negative aspect is that the chaebols will be limiting your profitability. When the chaebols suffer, you will suffer. And there's very little opportunity to do independent product development that would help you grow outside of the chaebol influence area. What you would like to see is that the Korean SMEs and technology startups would be able to shift to this virtuous cycle where they actually have enough funding and enough profitability and cash flow to develop globally competitive products and then become independent in their own right. Some Korean companies have succeeded with this, but this is still a minority compared to the overall SME landscape. Now, one thing we have to say about the Korean government is that we certainly cannot blame them for not interfering and not supporting the startup environment. They are putting a lot of money into this. But as I said, there's been a lot of research done, and this research has been looking at other countries who have been doing these kind of things. Unfortunately, typically when government interferes in the startup ecosystem, the result is wasting a lot of money. And if you look at the statistics here on the right, where you see the survival rate of startups, you can see that Korean startups are not faring at all better than anybody else. I mean, it's normal that survival rate is low by the 5th year, but you would think that if the government focuses on success in every case, and if they put this much money into the ecosystem, you would see better survival rates over the time. You don't. The survival rate is bad on the 1st year. The survival rate is bad also on the 5th year. And now some of you guys may be saying, but hey, Per, you know, I've been looking at the news and there's always talk about these unicorns and everything great in Korea. And yes, it looks like this. So there's a bunch of unicorns, so-called unicorns in Korea. And some of them have gotten more attention. For example, TOS, which is here marked as Viva Republica, that's the parent company of TOS. But if you look at these unicorns, first of all, they are today still being funded. So they are unicorns in name only, in the sense that people often say that the unicorn is something that reaches $1 billion value, $1 trillion value in valuation. That means in the funding rounds, which is done by investors and still on the private market. But to realize the unicorn value, you would have to go through an IPO and become an independent company, such as has happened with Google or Facebook or others. And these companies haven't done that. Also, the other thing is most of these companies are consumer companies. So the question is, which ones of these companies will actually survive in the long run? For example, Yellow Mobile, there's been a lot of debate about that, whether that one actually was a real company or not, because it looked good on the outside and its valuations went up, but actually has never realized the potential of it. Similarly for these other companies, I think right now, TOS or Viva Republica is very close to potentially becoming something that is real. Coupang maybe also, but they are still dependent on external funding. So this talk about unicorn is actually what I would call media publicity. The real question is which one of these become real, mature, stable companies that then have a future of their own as independent companies, independent of investors. Let me see here. Oh, okay, that was just a chat there. Okay, so then the good thing is Korean startup investment has been expanding. So there is more money available for the Korean startups. And also big companies, big technology companies, I mean, chaebols are interested in this. The negative aspect is, of course, then, and also the global investors are interested in some of the, I mean, TOS, for example, is getting international money. The negative aspect is that the Korean venture capital players, they are not behaving in the same way as Western venture capitalists. So in Western venture capitalists, you have people in the very early stage, they're called angel investors or seed investors. And then you have the early stage investors, and then you have the growth investors. And typically, if you're an angel investor, you follow the company across this journey all the way to IPO or trade sale. In Korea, that doesn't happen. Because there's such a pressure on realizing returns and showing success, these VCs actually jump off the ship much earlier in order to show that they have done something at least. So there is not this culture of actually sticking to the investment to the end, but rather it's a continuous search for short-term gains. And that, of course, doesn't fit well with venture capital because typically building a technology company takes anywhere between 10 to 15 years. And again, by the way, you might be misled by the media. The media loves the story about, the company was founded 1 year ago and now it's flying high. That isn't really reality. Most technology companies have a history of 5 to 10 years, typically 15 years before they actually become successful. So it's just good to keep that in mind. All right. So then a couple of things about, I already mentioned the wage gap. So SME companies certainly don't have a lot of, the wage gap to the big companies is big, and that's also a big driver of the Korean inequality. The same thing with startups, of course. Also, another strange thing about the Korean startup ecosystem is that typically the system is such that they prefer having one single dominant owner. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Kosdaq prefers that when a company is IPO'd, it has that the CEO has a big stake. And the reason is because they like to have management stability. And it's also an anti-fraud measure in the sense that they don't want the CEO to sort of, trick the public investors. So they want the CEO to stick with the company and be tied to the successes. And the other reason for this is that the legal environment in Korea is still very young, especially when it comes to venture capital. So the challenges are that there is not sort of the legal framework for shareholder agreements and investment agreements is still sort of very young. And as a result, then, there typically are not proper contracts made. And so having a one strong owner makes it easier to deal with the legal issues in a company. But this, of course, is completely opposite from the West. Because in the West, you usually have the founders and even the employees and later additions to the team, they have all a stake in this. And of course, the investors have as well. So there's a cultural difference there. And then, of course, I already mentioned that many parents and also, I think, younger generation, they're a little bit reluctant of going into startups because it doesn't feel like it's safe. And it's true, it is not safe. I mean, obviously many things fail, but in general, there is not that kind of a culture. In the West, many people from corporations join a startup if it has if it looks interesting. Whereas you would hardly find anybody from a chaebol like Samsung jumping ship and going into a startup. That would be both sort of unprecedented from a cultural point of view, but I think also because they are afraid that they would cause some bad blood inside Samsung. And here I want to share with you a story from Finland, because when I was doing investments in Finland in the 2000, we had a lot of mobile tech companies in our portfolio, and we tried to pitch them to Nokia. Nokia never bought a Finnish startup. And one might wonder why. Was the technology any worse? Answer is no, the technology was very good. But it was actually a little bit of a sinister reason. Nokia did not want any Finnish entrepreneur, startup entrepreneur, to be rich, because they actually benefited from the fact that the Finnish engineers were quite cheap. So the salaries of Nokia engineers was quite low, and that was a big benefit for Nokia. Now, if startup entrepreneurs would become rich, then there would be a temptation for these talented engineers to jump out from Nokia, create their startup, and sell it back to Nokia. So by not buying Finnish startups, they sent a strong signal that if you leave Nokia, you will never come back, and we will not buy your company. You have to survive on your own. And I think in Korea, we have a little bit of the same mentality with the chaebols. Now, my colleague Ho Sang-Young has been doing some research, and we have looked at what kind of startups we have here in Korea. So right now, this is still work in progress. So we've gone through a large number of the various accelerators, and also we talked to the expert in the market. And this is what it looks like right now. Now, this is a very busy slide, and we're not going to go into the details. But what you see on the x-axis on the top there is various industries. And then what you see on the y-axis here is where in the technology stack the company is positioned. So front end and dedicated services, that's sort of the kind of companies who are actually interacting with the customer, be it B2B or B2C. Platform aggregation, that's the typical companies who have a broader they are either portals or they're somehow collecting users or services onto their platform, and they are providing the platform services. Middleware is somewhere in between. Typically a part of telecom, for example, there is middleware things. And then we have the backend, which is sort of the deep tech, which really goes into the infrastructure and the deep tech. And we marked here a little bit of a red area there on the bottom, because those are hot areas today. And we expect that we should find more companies there in that area. But if you are interested in acquiring Korean technology startups and you have a certain industry in mind, this kind of map would be your first sort of starting point. You would take a look at this map and see, okay, what kind of companies do I have? And then you might make a deep dive and look into specific spots. But as I already mentioned before, a lot of the Korean startups, just like the SMEs and the private equity investments, they are in the consumer discretionary and consumer staples. So B2C type of businesses, and usually in the front end, which means they're not very deep tech. So they are sort of fairly simple companies which can be copied. And when I say not deep tech, what do I mean by that? So if I think Uber, for example, is Uber deep tech? Answer is no. The Uber service technology was something that was replicated in multiple companies very quickly after Uber was founded. And in Southeast Asia, for example, you see companies like Grab now overtaking Uber. So Uber is an example of a front-end consumer services kind of a company in transportation area, where the actual technology behind it is not that sophisticated. It's something that many companies can do and do. Whereas then something in the back end may be very deep tech. And I've taken here a couple of samples. I mean, next two slides are examples of companies that we find in Korea, and I think you find them interesting. But just to illustrate the point that there are deep tech companies here as well. And one of the interesting companies we found was Semi5, which is in the semiconductor manufacturing. So this, if you look at the previous slide here, you can find it at the bottom here, actually where the speech bubble is, it says Semi5. So that's actually in the technology space in semiconductor manufacturing in the back end. So that would be your example of a deep tech company where the management and the key personnel typically are highly trained. They may have industry experience from a large corporation, or maybe they have been US educated and have experience from there, and then they come back and are developing services that are not very easy to replicate. Another example that we have is ViewMagine, which is actually, as a technology goes, it's not that complicated. Basically, they have drone and visual imaging technology that they use, but they have been able to apply these technologies to deeper and deeper areas to understand how steel structures are holding together, and also to monitor facilities. So in their case, the base technology was fairly straightforward, but then they have just sort of applied it to certain industries. Now, why did these two companies emerge, and how come they are sort of have a technology capability? Again, you have to look at the history of Korea. So in terms of Semi5, the point is that Korea has a long experience of semiconductor processing, and so a startup in that area is not that surprising. And in terms of Pew Imagine, Korea has a long history of production monitoring and production improvement. So the roots of this company is actually people who have been working in factories trying to improve production processes and doing that with image processing or quality inspection using images. So typically deep tech companies, they emerge in areas where the country or the region already has decades of experience, and then that experience can be channeled into a startup company. All right, I better speed up. This section on private equity is a little bit longish and a little bit sort of legal and regulative and so on. So I'm going to sort of run across it pretty quickly. But the main message of this section is that there is increased investment interest in technology companies, and there's also increased funding. So you can expect good things to happen. And also right now, M&A activity, especially in the smaller sizes of companies, is picking up. So there's also activity. So although the first part of the section is a little bit sort of pessimistic about the technology investment, I think the latter part is the key point that, hey, things are getting better and it's actually accelerating. But first thing to understand is the legal environment. Whereas US and Europe, they have a very standardized legal environment for private equity. And typically, private equity players are very specific. So if you're a venture capital player, you focus on early stage. If you're a buyout, you focus on mid-stage or mid-sized companies which already have a business. You're not looking at technology so much, but you are maybe consolidating an industry. And mezzanine is focusing on companies who are about to get IPO'd and need some funding. In Korea, there's been a lot of legal sort of changes. And you can see here from the years that these legal changes are still happening. So these are fairly recent changes. If you look at the European and US environment, you wouldn't see this much legal activity in the private equity and venture capital base. The basic legal framework already exists. But in Korea, that basic legal framework has basically been established since 2000. And even after 2010, there's been a lot of different changes. And partially this has been for regulation reasons. Partially government has been worried about anti-fraud. It has also been worried about foreign investors stepping in and taking over. So there's been many reasons why this has happened. But unfortunately, still, there's a lot of regulation, and creating a PE fund is still a little bit tricky, and you have to sort of observe that. And as a result, many venture capital focused players, they actually do many things. They do partially consulting, they do partially funding and fundraising. So usually they are not pure breed investment companies. And that's sort of one of the challenges, because in venture capital, it is actually necessary that the investor is able to add value to the startup, because the startup usually doesn't have the skills internally. So having a venture capital fund that's a little bit of a mixed bag of different kind of things and different focus areas doesn't really work. The best venture capital funds in the world are strictly focused, maybe even focused on one technology or a few technologies, and then they have a huge network by which they are able to drive the company growth. This is not the case of Korean venture capital companies, and that's partially due to the legal framework being a little bit mixed up. Now, this is a little bit an old slide, but what you can see here, the total number of PE funds is listed there with the dashed line. You can see the growth numbers here. These are CAGR numbers, so compound annual growth rates. And then you can also see how much capital has been raised. And the black area is the capital overhang, which means unallocated capital. Now I have a little bit newer slide here as well, which shows here that in recent times, the big investors, the big private equity firms have raised a lot of capital, and they have quite a lot of sort of what we call dry powder or unallocated capital there. Also, due to COVID, there's a lot of companies now which are pretty sizable and have some technology component that are coming to the market. So that might also revitalize this. Here's a map of various players in the Korean market. On the x-axis here, you see the local versus global players. We are focusing now on the local players because venture capital typically is handled by local players. And what we would like to see on this chart is, of course, at the lower left corner here would be highly populated. Unfortunately, it is not. Now, this is not an exhaustive slide, but regardless, the point is that still a lot of the activity on the private equity side in Korea is focused on the mid and large cap companies, and it's more transactional than technology development driven. Now, one of the criticism of Korean private equity companies, and this is not only venture capital, but also the buyout companies, is that they don't really add much value. It's more about momentum and sort of doing certain acquisitions and others that drive the value. And that criticism is quite valid to some sense, because partially it has been driven by regulation, and partially the role of private equity in Korea is a little bit different than in the West. In the West, it's more driving the economy, whereas here it's more of a providing liquidity to a market. But if I go forward here, you can see that whereas South Korea in the past was very focused on these traditional industries and not so much on IT, it's actually improving now. And but we are still behind Japan and China, for example. So this is also a challenge, but it's increasing. And here you can see a little bit of how the technology investment is, relatively speaking, increasing. And here Korea is taking a bigger relative position over the years. Now, the good news is startup capital or venture capital into the early stage is increasing. And there's been a lot of fundraising activity. And obviously, if there's fundraising, the venture capital cycle is about 10 years. So if you get money today, then in about 10 years, you have to close your funds and return the returns to the investors. So the fact that we are seeing a lot of activity in 2016, 2019 indicates that these funds who have raised this capital, they have to perform over the next 10 years. And hopefully by the end of this decade, we will see at least some of them succeeding. For sure, many of them will fail as well because they are not ready for this. But that's what I'm saying, that by 2030, we should see a fairly active venture capital and technology startup environment in Korea. And it should be different than what we have today. If that happens, that will be really good news for Korean economy. But jury's out, obviously. Today, most of the companies, they are not exiting through IPO. Rather, they are exiting through something called secondary. And this secondary is really a nasty thing because it basically is a private equity house selling the company to another company. And this is basically just a musical chairs type of exit. So that is not good. M&A is increasing, and that's good. And obviously, this is the message of this presentation, that if European companies would find it attractive to acquire some of the Korean technology companies, that might be a good thing for the economy. And it might be interesting for some of the companies who have the courage and the capabilities of doing so in the early stage, because we are seeing more and more interesting technology companies here in Korea. I'm finally just wanted to mention that M&A activity, it had a drop during the COVID, but now it has been increasing. The number of transactions is up, and it's clearly towards more of the small-sized companies. Now we're already at 45 minutes, so I'm not going to go deep, but suffice it to say, in this last section of this presentation, and I have a sort of a manual on how you should do this kind of market scan, how you can identify targets, how you can map them, what are the typical tools that you need, what is the process, how much time do you need to do it, and also I talk a little bit about the M&A process and what happens. Now, I'm going to say, I'm not going to go into detail of this. I think you can read it yourself, but I want to say a few words about this. When you acquire a company in Korea, life is very different from acquiring a Western company. And there's a number of reasons for that. But first of all, before you acquire anything, there's a big job in checking the financials, IPR, the management team, the ownership structure. So legal due diligence is critical because the legal framework or the contractual framework can be hard to understand or can in some cases be non-existent. And the IPR regulations in Korea are a little bit different as well. So whether the IPR is actually valuable or not is sort of a question. Ownership structure. Usually most of these companies are dominated by one single player. And that's good to understand because that means that if you want to keep the team working, you have to provide them completely new incentives. Unfortunately, also typically you have to retain the CEO because the way Korean companies work is that the CEO controls everything and does not share that information. As a follow-on on that, of course, you have to understand the power balance in the relationships. Korean companies are typically run in silos. So each person understands their own silo, but only the CEO understands the whole system. And then you have to understand Confucian principles because there's often you will find in these companies some relationships between the CEO and the employees, and they are not necessarily as transparent and clear as they might be in a Western company. When it comes to integration, Usually in the Western world, we do the integration pretty quickly, 100 days or at least a couple of years. In Korea, that is very difficult. So you usually have to spend 2, 3, or even 5 years to do the integration. And that's because process changes are very slow. Nobody wants to step on each other's toes. And it's very hard to understand the intrinsic sort of movements in the company and how the power balances go. Legal and regulatory matters are not that complicated. But you do have to understand Korean labor law, because that is completely different, and that's sort of very tricky thing to do. So that's sort of something to pay attention to. I have more on this in the appendix. Now, finally, I want to mention something. So if you have been acquiring companies before, you maybe know that there's a financial due diligence, there's legal due diligence, and there's also business due diligence. One thing that we recommend doing when you do an acquisition in Korea is that you also do a culture diagnostics or culture due diligence. And that's because culture and language play such a big role in these companies. All right, I think we have a time for Q&A now. Sorry for sort of speaking fast and speaking a lot, but I hope you found at least some of this interesting. Also, I collected here a list of further readings if you're interested in either some of the regions here or some of the topics. But let me now at this point stop the sharing and open the floor for discussion. And I guess I have to take a look at the chat. All right. There's a question here first for recommendation on public-private partnership for startup ecosystem development. Korean government selected some next growth engine technology areas, and PPP would be important, but how the PPP works matters. Yeah. This is a very tough question. You know, the experience from Nordic countries was that the public-private partnerships work best when the government steps away and takes a smaller role. So government can have a role in funding R&D and technology development, but when it comes to technology selection or driving certain areas, unfortunately, you know, past experience shows that government is not the best possible party to do so. And I'm trying to think of this one book that there is a book about this as well. It's so called something like Road to Disappointments or something like that. But that book made by one of the Harvard professors in this area talks about this. So government after government has failed in their attempts to pick up certain growth engine areas. So my answer to you is that the first step is to understand that the technology environment, it's already there, because you can't develop a technology unless the country has a history in that area. So from that point of view, the areas where a country can excel typically are already set by its history. The key part for the government is to provide some funding into areas where otherwise funding is not, or in the early stage. And the other thing is that the government can do is give incentives for the large corporation to participate in this partnership. So I think that's sort of an important thing. Today, chaebols claim that they participate, but have you seen a chaebol trying to really drive a startup to success on its own? No, you usually find a chaebol buying the startup or taking over the startup. I hope that answers your question. I'll go to the next question now. We can return to this question again, of course. Would you say the current pandemic has similar positive impact on startups like Nokia collapsing, or the opposite? And also, would you say Tallinn has benefited primarily from the closeness to Helsinki, or the other important factors? Ah, very good. Yes, and that comes from Latvia. I would say that the Baltic countries, so Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Tallinn, of course, being in Estonia, they are quite entrepreneurial because they have managed to get free from more or less free from Russian influence. And I think in Tallinn, definitely there is an entrepreneurial spirit that is actually part of the culture there. So Estonians have been very active, and sure, the closeness to Finland and Sweden has been a benefit for them, but it's not the only factor. There certainly is also an eagerness to take risk and to be an entrepreneurial and to also show things. And I think the government in Estonia has also been very active. They are pushing technology and technology infrastructure. So from that point of view, it's not only Helsinki there, but of course, it's always good if you have another country which is a little bit further ahead in technology development that can help you. And the pandemic, well, it's been good and bad. Obviously, some of the companies have collapsed during this, and it also forced private equity investors to think short term. So that's the bad thing. But at the same time, I think for venture capital and startup companies, having a hard time is usually a good thing, because it kills the weak ones. And I'm sorry to say this, but unfortunately, in this environment, in the startup ecosystem, this is like a jungle. And a good startup ecosystem is one where there's continuous creative destruction. And why do I say that? The reason is that you don't want to spend any resources on weak companies. So the faster a weak company dies, the better. Why? Well, those people who were in that weak company, they have to find new jobs. And if they are entrepreneurial, they will usually find jobs in other startups. So when weak companies die, it actually releases resources for the strong companies. So my answer to you would be yes, the pandemic has been a good thing for the global startup ecosystem. All right, let me go then to okay, you were happy with that one on the PPP. Good, happy to talk more about that, of course. I'm a little bit so I actually talk to Korean government people and government organizations all the time, and we of course collaborate with them. And this is a tough nut to crack, but we have to remember that in Korea, there's a long, and also in China, I mean, the Mandarin culture and having the government officials being highly trained and all that. So there's a big cultural thinking that the government knows best and the government has the smartest people. But the whole point about the venture capital and startup ecosystem is that it's an unpredictable environment. It is not about the wisdom of participant, but it's about the jungle working in an effective way. So that's why I'm saying that government, no matter how intelligent it is, it wouldn't be successful in choosing the right technologies. And that's what the Western economies, Silicon Valley is not controlled by anybody. And that is actually why it works. So that's sort of my point to the PPP still. All right, then there's a question about the small market in the Nordics actually helps startups over there. How do you see the geography of Korea affecting the startup ecosystem? Has it been a positive or negative? Well, it is actually a little bit of a negative because Korea is 50 million and let's say Finland is 5 million, Sweden is 10 million. So Korea is bigger than all the Nordic countries together. So Korea, and still Korea is not super big. So US is 300 and something million and Japan is 100 million. They are bigger, obviously. And China, of course, huge. But Korea at 50 million is like Germany. So there is big enough a market for an entrepreneur to have activity here. And that easily becomes an excuse because it's easier to sell to a Korean, language issues and others. So from that reason, I say that the fact that Korea is 50 million and not 5 is a little bit of a negative factor because it makes the entrepreneurs look for opportunities at home. And unfortunately, they often end up in the claws of a chaebol, which then restricts their growth opportunities sort of in the global arena, at least in the short to medium term. So I would say it's a bad thing. The good thing about 50 million and Korea being sort of what it is that there's a lot of technology here. So we would have the capability to build great technology companies, but we would need to change the attitude. And that's what the Scandinavian companies or Nordic companies always have had. They knew that they can't sell to anybody in their home country. So they immediately went to Germany, France, UK, US, and China. So they are very active on that. And I think we need that in Korea as well. And I'm hoping that the next generation of startup entrepreneurs, which will be emerging in 2025 to 2030, would be that generation who have the language skills, who have experience of the global venture capital environment and all of that, and they would step out. But right now, even the examples we showed here in the presentation, they are still stuck in Korea. And by the way, all the unicorns completely stuck in Korea. Even TOS. TOS is not a global player, it's a completely Korean player. And that's a negative factor if you want to, I mean, Google obviously being a global player, and that's sort of the difference there. Oh, tough question following from India, Indian tech ecosystem. Yeah, that would be a very interesting topic to have a comparison. Now I don't have it right here available for you, but it's a very interesting topic because India actually has some similarities with Korea. Both countries have a strong link to US, partially because the expatriates, partially because of sort of historical reasons. And India, of course, also has a strong tech connection to Europe and the West, because of all the IT integrators and the call centers and all the outsourcing companies, Accenture, all of these big brands, they have offices in India and they are developing that. So India is very interesting. Similarities to India and Korea, I think government is a little bit similar. It's a different government, different policy, different culture, I know that. but still the government behavior in India is still a little bit restrictive. And obviously a big issue in India, of course, is also the infrastructure. So I think Korea is in that sense much more advanced, that the infrastructure and technology is more readily available. Maybe I would say then that Korea is more hindered by its culture than India. But on the other hand, India has then other sort of challenges. But certainly in both countries, entrepreneurial activity and technology startups are very important for the national economy. So I think that both need to have more venture capital and private equity, and both have a good connection to the West in one way or another. But there are sort of some intrinsic factors that still are preventing them from becoming a very thriving and active ecosystem. But yeah, very interesting topic. Another interesting topic is, of course, Iran and the Middle East, and also Vietnam, a very interesting topic in the same context of comparing to Korea. We have some material on that on our website, but I'm not going to dig into that. Whoa, okay, 55 minutes of non-stop talking. I think I'm pretty much pooped out here, and that's all I have to say. And thank you for the questions, and of course, happy to continue these discussions offline. But at this point, I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining, and it was a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation, Mr. Stanius. This is very meaningful time to learn about the startup business, and I hope our audience also gets some great insight and knowledge from this session. And do you have any last words to audience?
Well, I hope, I noticed from the participant list that there are both people from the companies as well as people from embassies and other sort of government agencies. So I hope that you take this message back to your governments or your respective countries and you think about it. When it comes to technology ecosystems, they are ecosystems, and usually country to country collaborations are also important. So I don't think this is a matter of only Korea, where Korea should benefit or something. I think this is a matter where if we Western countries or Asian or Middle Eastern countries, Southeast Asian countries work with Korea together, it's actually a win-win for all the parties. It's a win also for the corporations as well as for the startups. So in this sense, I would like to encourage you to take this topic back to your home and talk about it with people and discuss about the opportunities, because they are there. And this collaboration will actually provide the virtuous cycle that we all need in the current economic situation. So hopefully this has inspired you to do exactly that.
Yes, thanks for your comments. And then now it's time to close. And we will share the presentation file by email after this session. And this webinar will be uploaded on ECCK YouTube on October 21st. And thank you again for joining our session today, and hope you have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.